I should be wearing the cowboy hat.
The good thing is, families don't really come around here because it's so steep.
No, f***ing really?
Yeah.
No, I wonder why. I'm so glad I didn't wear a f***ing dress.
You would have flashed us all about 7 times walking down there. I'm fine.
God damn it. So, this week to crack off with I'm actually starting to make more interesting things, I've decided that I'm going to make something that's still fairly meta and still fairly about my projects and talk about what I use in terms of software on a day-to-day basis. I'm aware that often people who get into this field will already have their own personal preferences and things like that. For code editors, that's pretty much unanimous. You either have a favourite in one of the more complex ones like VS Code, or you use something like Vim if you're insane. But I'm aware there's a lot of stuff that doesn't really go noticed. There's a lot of stuff that isn't used as frequently or even isn't mentioned. So I figured this week we'd just take a leisurely stroll through the kind of software that I use on a day-to-day basis when I'm doing my job, and talk about some other things that you might be interested in that you haven't heard of before. I know I found a lot of very useful utilities as I've been going through the years, and there's things that you might not initially think of as softwares that are actually really useful to mention. So, with that said, I figured it's much better if I don't talk about this while on camera and just send you over to VoiceOver me to do the rest of the talking. VoiceOver me?
Thanks for that on-camera me.
Pretentious.
What did you just say?
Nothing.
No,
nothing.
You know what? Maybe it's best if you go. Maybe
Don't do that.
Yeah, there we go. That's much better. Right, now it's just you and me. Let's go through the softwares that I use. First off, we're going to talk about Code Editor. I'm fairly basic, so I use VS Code, or rather Visual Studio Code by Microsoft, as my primary code editor. Occasionally I'll do bits and pieces in Nano, but that's primarily just when I'm working on configuration files on a server. VS Code is fairly simple as far as code editors go, but for my use cases it's perfect. It takes a lot of its influences from Visual Studio, which I've also used, but instead of having IDEs directly integrated into it, you instead download extensions made by the community, or developers of these projects, to enhance its functionality. For me, I use a fair few in terms of just libraries of things like C#, Node.js, React Native, things like that, but I also use a couple to just enhance my experience with it, with plugins such as Beautify and VS Code icons, as well as more useful tools such as the Firebase and Firebase Explorer. We'll talk more about Firebase later, and things like Jira and Bitbucket for error tracking and source control. Obviously, VS Code has integrated source control. It has a lot of text editing tools that are fairly useful and things like that. That's why I use it. I also use the theme Tokyo Night. I used to use a theme called Tomorrow Night Blue, which I personally preferred. It was a lot more blue, but Tokyo Night's working fairly well for me at the moment. I tend to switch between them based on how I'm feeling. For a while I used Red. I'm not sure what came over me, but yeah, VS Code's highly useful, and it's what I use in my day-to-day. Next, let's go on to command prompts. I know that sounds fairly simple. Most people use just the standard command prompt in Windows. A fair few people use Git Bash, but I also want to mention another program called MobaXterm. MobaXterm is a mix of standard command prompt, Linux terminal, and SSH client. In fact, it can do a whole number of things, but that's primarily what I use it for. For me, I almost exclusively use it for SSH connect to my servers and VPSs. VPSs being virtual private servers, things that you can have hosted for you that are your own private server. No, but I use MobaXterm for SSHing into those. It's highly functional. It has SFTP, meaning I can transfer files directly to and from the server without having to open up another program. And it's highly responsive and just very clean and easy to use. So yeah, good program. Moving on to something not directly software based, but something I figured I'd mention when I was talking about server command prompts. I get my servers from a host called Vultr. Vultr are one of the bigger hosts around, but they offer highly competitive pricing, and personally I've never had any issues with them. I've only ever once had my servers inaccessible, and that was when I was creating a new server at the time when they were having some issues. They updated me frequently. They responded to my initial request within literally 1 minute, and that was a support ticket. They're highly capable of dealing with your stuff, so yeah, props to them, and I've never had any issues with them. In terms of what OS I use on my servers, going back to software, I just use Ubuntu Server. I'm aware there's probably better options out there, but frankly Ubuntu Server does everything I need it to do. It's not too over the top in terms of extra features, but it's not too underpowered. It's fairly well up to date because a lot of people use it, and frankly it's just my go-to for whenever I need a server operating system. Moving on to some more specifics, let's talk about web work. I'm going to talk more about the programming languages and stuff I use here. So for backends, I use Node.js. Node.js is JavaScript, but it can be run in a desktop environment, because JavaScript is code that your browser can run. It's part of most websites. Node.js is designed for running that in a server or desktop environment, so it's much more useful for running things like backends on servers, because you can write standard JavaScript but execute it as a desktop. That is combined with something called PM2, which is just a process manager for Node.js. It's highly useful, lets me monitor all the processes, and I run it on all of my servers. As well as Express.js. Express.js I've been using more recently than ever. It's just a web server utility for Node.js that's highly popular, and I really recommend it. That alongside things like SQLize, which I use for databases, and Passport.js, which I use for authentication and similar. Obviously there's details about that I can't disclose and things like that, but that's a rough idea of what I use for my backends. As far as frontends go, obviously HTML, CSS, JavaScript. If you've seen any web development, you probably know what they're about. As far as what I use for hosting, I use Apache web server instead of Nginx. Personally, I just prefer the configuration of Apache. It's what I got started with, and I just find it easier to work in that than I do in Nginx. So, where possible, I try to use Apache. I've had to use Nginx for a couple of things, but not much. Moving on to app work. App work, as I mentioned prior, I use Node.js. I also use React Native. React Native is React, which is a UI library for websites, but made into a native form so it can be run on iOS and Android. It's highly useful, if a bit over the top in terms of extra features and fluff. It's fairly intensive in terms of RAM usage and things like that, but it does the job if you're just trying to very quickly make an app and you don't want to get into the native libraries of Android or iOS. Particularly iOS, that can be a mess. I also use Firebase. Firebase I've mentioned before. It's a set of libraries made available by Google for free for starting off, but then you do have to pay as you get later into them, and you use them more and more. Firebase is highly... Yes, I have a cold. Firebase is highly usable in terms of just lots of things. It has authentication, it has databases, it has testing, it has notification software. It has basically everything you would need to make an app, and I frequently use it when I'm making my own apps. Now we're going to change pace a little bit, and we're going to talk about automations. I've frequently been infatuated with automation, as you've seen from my home assistant videos, but what I haven't also talked about is automating my work, or automating my programming and things like that. I've been particularly inspired by Taran van Hemert, a former video editor at Linus Media Group who recently went independent, whose entire raison d'etre was automating their process, making their processes quicker, being as efficient and paying as much attention to detail as possible. They were known for having 4 to 5 macro keyboards on their desk at any given time, just so that they could do quick commands much quicker, and they have perfect examples of that. So I chose to use a Corsair K55. I know we said we were talking about software, but you know what, we're talking about gear ones now. And AutoHotkey to create a bunch of scripts. None of my scripts are fully there yet. I'm working on debugging them, but frankly just haven't had the time. It's something I want to get into when I have a bit more free time. Other than that, let's talk about this series, in fact. Because other than that, I could go into specifics like, oh, I use Steam and Outlook and whatever, but I feel like that's fairly standard. What I do want to mention is this series, because you may be surprised to learn that I don't edit in Premiere Pro. Actually, come to think of it, no, that's not surprising, I'm a cheapskate. I edit in a program called DaVinci Resolve. DaVinci Resolve, there is a free version available of, and a studio version. It's made by Blackmagic Design, the same people who make Ursa cameras and a bunch of other things that I can't be bothered to get into. And it's basically Premiere with less effects functionality, but more color grading and semi-functional effects functionality. And it's free. Well, the free version's free. Obviously there's a lot of effects that you can't use if you don't pay, but there is a lot of it that you can use for free, and it's perfect if you're starting video editing and you want to get into something big, but you don't have the money to spend on Premiere. This is what I use. And it means I don't have to resort to pirating Sony Vegas or Premiere, which I'd rather not do. As far as recording goes, right now I'm recording using Audacity. Normally I would be recording using my camera, so there's nothing to mention in terms of software for that. If I ever need to record stuff on my desktop, I use OBS, or if I'm just doing screenshots, I'll use my screenshot software ShareX, which is highly useful. It basically takes Windows Snipping Tool and ups it to 11, in that you can edit images on the fly while you're taking screenshots, you can blur stuff out, you can pixelate stuff, all while you're taking the screenshot. And then once you've taken the screenshot, you can have it saved locally to your disk immediately, you can have it copied to your clipboard, you can have it uploaded to a service of your choice, which is what I use. I have all of my screenshots from a bunch of my devices automatically upload to a Discord server, which is really useful. And it's just little automations like that which makes ShareX a really good software to use. I'm now literally looking at my bottom bar to see if there's anything else I should mention, but I think I'm about good. There are a couple honourable mentions I want to make. They're more websites and things like that, but I figure I talked about Firebase earlier. This is a mess of a video because I'm not feeling that well, so I'll probably end up redoing this at some point, but we might as well go through them. devdocs.io is a website where you can get documentation for basically every programming language you could ever want or need. There's like almost 100 on there. And the best part is they can all be downloaded so that you can access them online. The website automatically downloads itself so that it works offline, and then you can just download different libraries. So if you're, say, offline and you need the documentation for React Native, you can just go, boop, React Native, and as long as it's downloaded, it'll just be there, which is fantastic. You can do version switching and everything like that. It's perfect. Moreover, in terms of web development, I use RecBin. RecBin you're probably more aware of if you do web development, but it's just an easy way to make web requests without having to resort to using curl. You can just put the web address you're in there, put any tokens, put any content, and it just sends it off without any issue. I've never once had an issue with using it, it's always worked perfectly, so yeah, it's really useful. And I think that's about everything. Again, I'm probably going to end up coming back to this because there's just so much I use. And this was kind of a rushed video because I'm feeling like death. But yeah, I hope that's been interesting to you. I hope you've learned something, and I hope that some of these softwares might be useful to you if you're considering getting into any of the things that I do, be it video editing or programming. Right, thanks for watching.
Voiceover me, why did you make no sense? Why would he I'm so blush. Go look at me, I do voiceovers. What does he expect me to record the outro if he can do it? I don't care. I'm done. What do I do? Get out of my head.